Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, wrapped in a silk robe, her fingers tracing the rim of a half-empty wine-glass. The warm glow of the chandelier cast flickering shadows across the lavish bedroom, its elegance a stark contrast to the hollowness she felt inside, the grand king-sized bed, the imported furniture, the shimmering curtains, all symbols of a life that should have been perfect. Yet the silence in the room was suffocating, a constant reminder of the loneliness that had settled into her bones. Daniel was away again, caught up in endless business trips, his promises to return early always broken by last-minute meetings and urgent calls. At first she had believed his excuses, convinced herself that this was the price of success. But as the months passed, her patience had worn thin, the absence of his presence, his touch, his attention. It had become unbearable. A marriage built on luxury but deprived of intimacy felt more like a beautifully decorated prison. She exhaled slowly, taking another sip of her wine. The rich taste lingered on her lips, but it did nothing to soothe the ache inside her. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, surrendering to the silence, but then a sound. Soft footsteps approached, almost hesitant but deliberate. Her eyes snapped open as she turned toward the doorway. The door creaked slightly, and there he was, Arav. Sophia stiffened, gripping the edge of the bed. Arav had worked in their household for years, always respectful, always at a distance. He was quiet, efficient, never overstepping his role. But now something was different. The way he stood at the doorway, the way his dark eyes lingered on her. Arav, she said, her voice uncertain, do you need something? He took a slow step forward, his gaze unreadable. I heard you call for someone, he replied smoothly. Her brows furrowed. I didn't. A faint smile touched his lips as he took another step closer. I must have imagined it then, but you look lost in thought. His voice was calm, unshaken. Sophia's heart pounded, not in fear, but in something else, something unfamiliar. There was something bold in his stance, something confident in the way he looked at her. She had never noticed before, or maybe she had chosen to ignore it. You shouldn't be here, she said, standing up, her silk robe slipping slightly off her shoulder. Arav's eyes flickered to the exposed skin for a second too long. I only wanted to check on you, he murmured. You're always alone. Sophia swallowed hard. The air between them shifted, thickening with an emotion she didn't want to name. She should have asked him to leave immediately. She should have called for another servant, closed the door, walked away. But she didn't. And that was her first mistake. Sophia took a step back, her pulse quickening as Arav closed the distance between them. The flickering candlelight in the room cast shadows over his face, highlighting the sharp intensity in his eyes. He was no longer the quiet, obedient servant she had always known. There was something different, something she had never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen to ignore. You need to leave, she said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Arav didn't move. His gaze held hers, unwavering, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. You're always alone, madam, he murmured, his voice smooth, controlled. He never comes home. He never looks at you the way you deserve to be seen. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The words struck a nerve, digging into a wound she had buried beneath layers of denial. She had never spoken about it out loud, never admitted how deeply Daniel's absence had hollowed her out. Yet here was Arav, standing before her, speaking the words she could never say herself. That's none of your concern, she snapped, more to convince herself than him. You are my employee, Arav. This is not appropriate. A slow smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. Maybe not, he agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. But tell me, do you want me to leave? Her heart pounded, the room suddenly feeling too small, the air too thick. Of course she wanted him to leave, she had to want that. But the way he was looking at her, the way his deep, unwavering gaze pinned her in place, she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her silk robe slipping off her shoulder. Arav took another step forward, and this time she didn't move away. You deserve more than an empty bed, he murmured, more than waiting for a man who barely remembers you exist. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She clenched her fists, trying to summon the anger she knew she should feel. This was wrong, so incredibly wrong, but why did her body betray her with the heat rising to her cheeks, with the slight hitch in her breath? Stop, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Arav reached up, fingers grazing her arm, his touch deliberate but gentle. Tell me to leave, he said again, softer this time, and I will. Sophia opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her body felt paralyzed, torn between the battle raging inside her. For years she had longed for someone to see her, to truly see her, and now someone finally did. Arav took that moment of hesitation as an answer. The distance between them disappeared, and before she could process it, the line had already been crossed. Sophia's breath came in short, uneven waves, her body tense with the weight of her unspoken thoughts. Arav's fingers still lingered against her skin, his touch igniting something she had long buried beneath years of loneliness and silent resentment. The space between them was dangerously thin, their breaths mingling, heavy with unspoken desires. I shouldn't be here, she whispered, almost to herself, her voice trembling under the weight of her own conviction, but she didn't step away. Arav's gaze never wavered, filled with something dark, knowing. Then tell me to go, he murmured, his voice smooth yet laced with challenge. Tell me this isn't what you've been waiting for. Sophia clenched her fists at her sides, trying to summon resistance. But the warmth radiating from him was intoxicating. Daniel's absence had left a hollow space within her, an emptiness that no amount of wealth or luxury could fill. She had spent too many nights staring at the empty side of the bed, listening to the echo of her own loneliness. Now, here was Arav, seeing her, touching her, making her feel something again. Her lips parted to say the words that would stop this before it went too far. But instead, she found herself whispering, "This is wrong." Arav exhaled slowly, his hand rising to her jaw, his thumb grazing her lower lip. "Does it feel wrong?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She should have pushed him away. She should have run. Instead, she leaned into the warmth of his palm, her body betraying her mind. His lips brushed against hers, just the faintest touch, a question rather than a demand. A shiver coursed through her knees weakening beneath her as every inch of her skin burned with awareness. He didn't force her, didn't pull her closer. He simply waited, giving her the power to decide. Sophia closed her eyes, a silent war raging within her. Loyalty to Daniel, the weight of her vows, the years of neglect, of cold beds and lonely nights. Then she surrendered. Her lips met his in a slow, desperate kiss, years of bottled-up emotions spilling out in a single moment. Arav groaned softly, his hands tightening around her waist, pulling her against him as if he had waited for this just as long as she had. Her hands found his chest, not to push him away, but to feel the solid warmth beneath his shirt. The night blurred around them, reality slipping away. The softness of the silk sheets beneath her, the warmth of his touch, the whispered words that filled the silence, all of it consumed her. There was no Daniel, no mansion, no rules. There was only this. And yet, as the night stretched on, as passion gave way to exhaustion, a single thought lingered at the edges of her mind. She had just made a mistake she could never take back. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting soft golden hues across the room. The warmth of the sun felt suffocating against Sophia's skin, a stark contrast to the cold dread curling in her chest. Her eyes fluttered open, and reality came crashing down like an unforgiving wave. The silk sheets tangled around her, the scent of another body still lingering in the air. She turned her head slowly, her heart pounding. Arav lay beside her, his breathing even, his face calm. There was no hesitation in his posture, no hint of regret. He looked at ease, almost victorious, as if he had finally claimed something he had been waiting for all along. Sophia pulled the sheets closer, her fingers digging into the fabric as she tried to steady her breath. A sickening weight settled in her stomach. What had she done? Her pulse hammered as images from the night before flashed in her mind. His touch, his whispers, the way she had given in so easily. She sat up abruptly, wrapping the sheets around herself as if they could somehow shield her from the shame washing over her. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her face. This wasn't just a fleeting mistake. This was betrayal. The sound of movement beside her made her freeze. Arav stretched lazily, his dark eyes opening to meet hers. A slow smirk tugged at his lips, and that single expression sent a chill down her spine. "You look like you're thinking too much," he murmured, his voice husky from sleep. Sophia's throat tightened. This shouldn't have happened," she whispered almost to herself. Arav propped himself up on one elbow, studying her. "But it did," he said, his tone calm as if nothing about the situation was wrong. "And you didn't stop it." His words stung. She wanted to deny them, to tell him that she had tried, that she had wanted to push him away, but she hadn't. She had wanted it just as much as he did, and that truth shattered whatever strength she had left. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "No one can know about this, Arav. No one." Arav sat up fully now, running a hand through his tousled hair. "Relax, Sophia," he said smoothly. "I'm not going to tell anyone." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "But that doesn't mean you can pretend this didn't happen." Sophia's stomach twisted. There was something in his tone, control, certainty, that made her uneasy. He wasn't pleading for her affection, wasn't questioning if she regretted it. No, he was claiming something. She pulled away, gripping the sheets as she stood, her legs shaky beneath her. "This was a mistake," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. Arav's smirk didn't fade. "Maybe," he said, watching her closely. "But tell me, Sophia, if I reach for you again, will you stop me this time?" The question hung in the air, suffocating, undeniable. Sophia felt her breath hitch, her body betraying the guilt screaming in her mind. She wanted to say yes, but she wasn't sure if it would be the truth. Sophia sat across from Daniel at the grand dining table, the glow of the chandelier casting a warm light over the perfectly arranged dishes. Everything about this moment should have felt normal. The quiet clinking of silverware, the occasional rustle of fabric as they shifted in their seats. Yet nothing felt the same. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her wine glass, bringing it to her lips to mask the dryness in her throat. Daniel was speaking about his latest business deal, his voice calm, collected, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. She nodded absent-mindedly, pretending to listen, but her mind was trapped elsewhere, back in that room, in that moment, wrapped in the sheets that still carried the scent of another man. "Are you okay?" Daniel's voice cut through her thoughts. She flinched slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. Yes, just a little tired, she said quickly, forcing a small smile. It's been a long day, Daniel nodded, returning to his meal, accepting her response without suspicion. But Arav, who stood silently by the doorway, clearing dishes with practiced efficiency, wasn't as easily fooled. His eyes burned into her, a flicker of amusement in them, as if he could hear every erratic beat of her heart. He was enjoying this, watching her squirm under the weight of guilt and secrecy. As Daniel continued talking, unaware of the silent war between them, Arav moved closer, pausing just behind her chair. His fingertips brushed against the back of her arm, a touch so fleeting yet deliberate, sending an involuntary shiver up her spine. She stiffened, her entire body tensing, but she couldn't react. Not with Daniel sitting right there. Arav knew that. He was testing her, taunting her. "Let me take this for you, madam," Arav murmured, his voice low just for her ears. Sophia clenched her jaw, pushing her plate away slightly, refusing to acknowledge him. But the smirk in his voice was unmistakable. He was toying with her, reminding her. The moment passed, but its presence lingered like an unwanted shadow. Later that night, as she stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, brushing her hair with slow, methodical strokes, she caught a movement behind her in the reflection. Arav. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, watching her with a familiar boldness. "You're acting strange," he mused, his voice casual, as if they were discussing the weather. Your husband is starting to notice." Sophia turned to him sharply, her pulse racing. "You can't be here." He took a slow step inside, closing the door behind him. "You don't really mean that." Her breath hitched. "This has to stop." Arav's gaze darkened. "Are you sure?" His head tilted slightly. "Because I don't think you want it to stop." Her stomach twisted. The dangerous game she had started was now out of her control. Sophia sat in front of her vanity, the soft glow of the bedroom lamp illuminating her pale face. Her fingers tightened around the delicate pearl necklace Daniel had gifted her on their anniversary, but her thoughts were far from the loving husband who slept soundly in the next room. Her heart pounded with unease, her nerves frayed from the suffocating weight of the secret she carried. A faint rustling sound made her freeze. She turned sharply toward the window, her breath catching. Nothing, just the wind. But the sensation of being watched refused to leave her. It had been like this for days. Whispers of a presence, subtle traces of intrusion. She would find objects slightly out of place, the scent of cologne that wasn't Daniel's lingering in the air. A folded note slipped beneath her jewelry box when she was sure she hadn't placed it there. Tonight was no different. As she reached for the small envelope resting on her vanity, her fingers trembled. She already knew who it was from. She had stopped reading them after the first few, yet every night a new one appeared. A reminder that he was always close. "You think you can ignore me, but I see everything. You belong to me now. It's only a matter of time." Her stomach twisted. Arav's presence had shifted from an intoxicating thrill to something much darker, an inescapable shadow looming over her every move. The door to the bedroom creaked open and she whipped around, heart in her throat. Relief flooded her as she saw Daniel standing there, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Sophia," his voice was thick with grogginess, "why are you still awake?" She swallowed hard, tucking the note into the drawer with a quick, practiced movement. "Just couldn't sleep," she lied smoothly, forcing a small smile. "Too much on my mind." Daniel stepped closer, his tired eyes studying her face. "You've been different lately," he murmured. "Distant. Is something wrong?" Panic surged in her chest. Could he sense it? The betrayal, the guilt, the presence of another man embedded in the very air they breathed. She forced a light chuckle, shaking her head. "I think I just need a vacation," she joked weakly. "Maybe we should take a trip, just the two of us." Daniel's lips curved into a soft smile as he kissed her forehead. "That sounds perfect. We'll plan something soon." Sophia exhaled slowly as he left, but the relief was short-lived. A presence lingered. A single flicker of movement near the doorway made her skin prickle with fear. The shadow retreated as quickly as it had appeared, but she knew. He was here, watching, waiting. Arav wasn't going to let her go. The game had become something far more dangerous, and she was no longer in control. Sophia's hands trembled as she clenched the edges of the kitchen counter. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She knew he was here. She had locked the doors, checked the windows, and yet Arav always found a way in. A slow, deliberate breath echoed behind her. She turned sharply, and there he was, leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. His presence sent a wave of dread crawling under her skin. "You've been avoiding me," Arav mused, his voice laced with amusement. Sophia's fingers dug into the countertop. "You need to leave, now." He didn't move. If anything, he looked even more comfortable, as if he belonged there. "Is that really what you want?" He tilted his head slightly. "Because I don't think you've made up your mind yet." Her heart pounded violently. "I have made up my mind," she snapped. "This was a mistake. It ends now." Arav's smirk faded, his eyes darkening. "I don't think you understand, Sophia," he said, his tone chillingly calm. "I own this secret now. I control what happens next." Sophia's stomach twisted. "Are you threatening me?" He stepped forward slowly, his movements calculated. "I'm giving you an option," he murmured. "Either we continue this arrangement, or I have a little chat with Daniel." The blood drained from her face. He wouldn't. Would he? Arav studied her reaction, clearly enjoying the power he had over her. "What do you think your perfect husband will do when he finds out?" he continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "How do you think he'll look at you after I tell him everything?" Sophia's breathing became ragged, panic tightening its grip around her chest. Daniel had always been understanding, kind, even when he was distant. But this would break him. Arav took another step closer, his voice low. "Be smart, Sophia. You don't want to lose everything, do you?" Something inside her snapped. A new, unshakable resolve hardened within her. For too long she had let this game control her. She had let him control her. No more. Sophia lifted her chin, her voice steady for the first time. "You're right, Arav," she said coolly. "I don't want to lose everything." He smirked, misreading her shift in tone. "Good girl!" Her fingers curled around the knife resting on the counter. Before he could react, she lunged forward, pressing the cold blade against his throat. Arav's body stiffened, his smirk vanishing instantly. "Now," she whispered, her lips barely an inch from his ear. "Who has control?" For the first time, Arav looked afraid. And Sophia, she had never felt stronger.